Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Right Time, a Wave original presented by Perplexity. My name is Bomani Jones. Thanks for listening wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for watching us on YouTube. Subscribe, like, rate us, review us, give us 5 stars. You only give us 4 stars. I'm inclined to believe you are a hater. It is that time of week where we have a guest join us. He works for ESPN covering the NBA, but he has got a book out now called The Wonder Boy. It is a look at the life and times of Luka Dončić. Tim MacMahon, how are you, sir?
Howdy, partner. I appreciate you having me. I'm here in Oklahoma City, where I understand you have a lineage of legendary proportion.
Yeah. No, my mom's there. It was actually the last time I was there was last May. OU gave my mom an honorary degree. I didn't think I would live long enough to see like my mom on one page and Toby Keith on the other side. Yeah, I was there with you on that one. Yeah, I was there until, I got a little mad at him about 5 years ago, and I haven't come back yet. But I can't. I was the one Texas fan in the whole OU household, and that didn't go over so well as so many places. But you have written this book about Luka. I want to talk about the book before we get into like what's going on with them as a team right now. But I found it to be interesting that you said that the book came about because somebody called Brian Windhurst about writing this book, and Brian sent him over your way. That is a homeboy Hall of Fame move right there.
That's my guy, Wendy. He lets me come on the Hoop Collector with him on a regular basis. So he gave me. Now I really think what happened though was Wendy didn't want to hear me bitching and moaning and whining about you. You're on my turf now, buddy. So yeah, he hooked it up. He's a facilitator. He's a distributor. The man gets his buckets. He's like Luka. He can give you 34, but he's going to get double figure assists too.
Now, I was curious though or I guess somewhat surprised that wouldn't have been something that you had thought of sooner. Like I imagine with beat writers when somebody like Luka shows up, whoever the first one is to write the book, like Marcus Thompson did one on Steph Curry and Kevin Durant with the Warriors, for example. And I imagine in my head that you guys are there, like somebody's just got to be the first one to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do it. I was a little surprised that nobody had jumped up sooner.
Well, I'll be honest with you. Writing a book is not something I necessarily was, it wasn't necessarily a goal of mine. It ended up being a business opportunity that presented itself. And, then if you're going to do it, it's got to become a passion project at that point. But when they came to me, I knew Luka wasn't going to sit down and like cooperate. It wasn't going to be some kind of traditional biography. So I started thinking, okay, if I'm going to write a book about him, what could I do that one, I would be interested in writing, that I think people would be interested in reading, and then I could execute without, really his cooperation. Obviously his voice is in there because I covered his whole career, but without his cooperation. And, to me, it was the pressure on a franchise when you draft a prodigy through the prism of Luka and the Dallas Mavericks, kind of build it, or they might eventually leave. Now, I never imagined this little plot twist at the very end, after the first print run, by the way, of you built it successfully, despite all kinds of drama, dysfunction, personnel missteps and mistakes. You put a contender around this guy. You were set up for a nice long run, coming fresh off of finals, nice long run as a contender, and you decided to dump him. There was a lot of time during it, because this book was like a summer project for the last few years. There were times I thought the book would end in a trade. I just never imagined it would be him getting backstabbed, blindsided. I thought it might be because they'd failed miserably to build around him, and he looked around and was just like, sheesh, I gotta get somewhere else. The way this went down is not a script development that I anticipated.
Yeah, well, first I want to applaud you for writing it, because I think there's the idea of writing a book for me is the most daunting proposition that there is. So like the discipline and everything it takes to do this. And I know it's hard enough to write for a magazine with how arduous the editing process is. So, I offer the initial salute on that. And I want to walk people like through the story a little bit, because I think something that's a little bit underrated about what the Mavericks have pulled off is that it's almost like what the Green Bay Packers have done with quarterbacks. The ability to go from having 20 years of Dirk to then having Luka, which is kind of like going through the Brett Favre era and then getting to Aaron Rodgers. Except I think what makes it more interesting is that Brett Favre was a super handful. And I remember a conversation you and I had a long time ago. I forget what it was about, but it was about some player, what was going on. And you're just like, yeah, it's been a little different for us in Dallas because we've had Dirk, who is just the consummate, everything that you would want a superstar to be, like a prodigy, but not quite like Luka, where there were questions about Dirk coming into the league that you didn't have so much with Luka. But what was it like to kind of give people background about the Luka era, covering or being around a team that was led by Dirk Nowitzki, who I think now time is starting to show that we actually probably underrated a little bit and may have been the best player in the NBA for a stretch.
Yeah, and so, Dirk was on his last legs, obviously, when Luka came in. And, it was like Dirk very willingly passed the torch. Dirk recognized the guy's talent right away. And Dirk would tell us, like, listen, you can't compare us as talents. Like, this Luka came in as the most accomplished European prospect ever. I mean, the dude won EuroLeague MVP, EuroLeague Final Four MVP as a freaking 18-year-old. Where Dirk was playing for the Wurzburg X-Rays in Germany's second division. Dirk got over here and was like, oh my God, I don't belong. Should I go home? And Luka got over here and was like, this league's easy. I'm lighting the world on fire. And it was funny because Dirk was always very willing, I would even say eager, to kind of be a mentor, but he didn't want to like push things down Luka's throat. So the year they played together, it wasn't like Luka was soaking up his wisdom. Let's say, hey, Dirk, teach me the ropes. Luka was just lighting the league on fire. And Dirk's like, hey, man, like, if you got any questions, I'm here. And then, Dirk was kind of the butt of Luka's joke. So they had a bond, but the mentor relationship really didn't develop until the years after Dirk left. And like the things the Mavericks would have loved for Luka to pick Dirk's brain about, I mean, sure, kind of the face of the franchise, the spokesman stuff, that would have been nice. But really, the diet, the conditioning, the discipline, well, there's still issues, but they're issues for a guy who hadn't hit his prime yet, has been a 5-time first-team All-NBA selection, and has led one team to a conference finals and a completely different supporting cast to the finals. So, there's flaws there, and it's, very different personalities, very different players. But I can just tell you this, of the few people in Dallas who had doubts about whether you could build a championship team around Luka or who didn't believe in him as a face of the franchise, Dirk damn sure was not in that group. And listen, Dirk's attended 2 games since his trade, 2 NBA games. One was Luka's debut with the Lakers in Los Angeles. The other was Luka's return to Dallas. I think those actions speak pretty damn loudly about how Dirk feels about Luka Dončić.
Well, the thing I wondered about with the idea that Dirk could give him this wisdom was, I don't think that it was ever going to become a thing for Luka until, for one reason or another, he hit his head up against the wall, right? Like Dirk could come say, these are all the things I did. And of course you needed to do these things, right? Like, you are not me. I don't have to do this. Like we saw with Michael Vick is a great example of football and all of this. And I wonder, in fairness to all parties involved, I don't think there was any way that you were ever going to explain to Luka why what you've been doing all this time isn't going to be good enough when clearly it's pretty goddamn good.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, Luka came in and he was a star right away. Rookie of the year, one of the best teenage seasons that we've ever seen in the history of the league. Like, put it up with like it was him and LeBron when you put the numbers up. And then the very next year, he couldn't buy a beer legally in America yet, and he was an MVP candidate. Like, it came easy. And so, yeah, like if Dirk was sitting here saying, hey, you got to change your ways, he'd have tuned him out, and like Carlisle couldn't tell him anything. Nobody could really tell him anything because it's hard to say you've got to change your ways when he was a top 3, top 5 player in the league as a 20-year-old, and again, success came awfully easily to him. Now, could he be better? Could there be, are there things he can improve? Sure. But it's hard for me to sit here and tell you Luka's way hasn't worked because it has. Is it like the roadmap that you'd recommend? Not necessarily, but damn. 5-time first-team All-NBA selection, and the guy's not hit his prime yet.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also interesting in this, as the story goes, the Rick Carlisle element is interesting because we noticed about Rick Carlisle. People forget this. The Pistons fired Rick Carlisle 22 years ago for being an asshole. Like, it really came down to that. They were really, really good. They had gone really far. And it's one thing to get fired for being an asshole. It's another thing to get fired for being an asshole and they replace you with Larry Brown. Like, what they are really saying is, it's not simply that you like cross over the threshold for what we're talking about here. You are otherworldly, but he's a great coach that won the championship with the Mavericks. But Jason Kidd was the only player that he had really allowed to run his offense. We saw when Rajon Rondo was in Dallas, Those two guys, whoever idea was for them two to play together, you didn't pay close enough attention to what it is. And then Carlisle winds up in this situation again, except it's with the young prodigy, and he figured out pretty quickly what the power dynamics were in that one.
Well, he figured it out pretty quickly, and he figured it out too late.
Yes.
Right? Because, I detailed there was a disaster of a team meeting in Toronto, fresh off a loss in Atlanta in Luka's fourth game of his career. Literally, you're a week into Luka's career. They blow a 26-point lead on TNT against the Hawks. And Carlisle just flipped out the next day in a team meeting. And it's like your typical like hotel ballroom, Ritz-Carlton ballroom film session. And Carlisle's just getting progressively more and more and more pissed off. That's when he calls out Dennis Smith Jr., the lottery pick the previous year, guy who basketball fit with Luka wasn't good, but like Dennis is a good kid. He like welcomed Luka, like he's playing Fortnite. He didn't even like Fortnite, but the kid wants to play Fortnite. Cool. I'll welcome him to Dallas. I'm trying to make him feel comfortable, whatever. And that's when Rick called Dennis Smith, "You're jealous of Luka." He's like, "What? We're cool. What are you talking about?" And then he just starts cussing and fussing. And it got to a point where it got so heated and Rick was so out of control that DeAndre Jordan, of all people, another guy a week into his Dallas tenure, the guy who left the Mavericks at the free agency altar a few years earlier, stands up, says, "Coach, you can't talk to us like that." And Carlisle damn near lost his job off of all this. He definitely lost control of the team, and he really lost respect from Luka. So he cracked the foundation of the relationship with Luka 1 week into Luka's rookie year. And look, Luka, if he's out on you, like he doesn't do a good job of masking his emotions. Let's just say that. And then Carlisle later on realized, okay, hey, if this is a power struggle, this is one I could lose. And so his strategy for the next almost 4 years was kissing Luka's butt regardless of circumstances. So he was completely incapable of trying to hold Luka accountable because of a mistake he made a week into his career. And so, that dynamic was difficult. Having said that, Rick also deserves credit for accelerating Luka's ascent to superstardom. When Luka got in the league, people didn't think he was a point guard. I remember there was an executive from a team that had a high lottery pick I was talking to right after the draft, and his comp was Hito Turkoglu. They thought he was like a player. Seriously, could you imagine? And I mean, a good player,
right?
But sheesh. I mean, Luka was putting up Hito Turkoglu's best numbers as a rookie, but people thought, hey, he's a playmaking forward. He's not going to be quick enough to be a primary ball handler. And Rick realized pretty quickly, like, nah, we need to give this dude the keys. And we need to basically, they changed the offense. Okay, Luka, here's the rock. We're spacing this thing around you. It's high pick and roll, and you're running the show. And Rick deserves credit for recognizing the talent for sure, but also for putting an offensive system in place that maximized Luka's talent right away. So as much as they butted heads, Luka did benefit from playing for Rick.
I think there are two things you said in that were interesting. One, Dennis Smith Jr. is a great example of how you have to be careful making assumptions about one's personality based on the way he plays basketball. Because, and it came through very much in the infamous Cuban quote about how American players just want to get their mixtapes right and everything else. He might as well have said, "I'm talking about him." And it was probably wildly unfair given the things that he was trying to do to help things work. But the other part that you got on is something I talk about on this show a lot. It's really easy to lose an NBA team. You can lose an NBA team just as quickly as you said right there.
Yeah, and again, Rick was a championship coach at the time, but he said, and this is a meeting where you got Dirk and JJ Barea, guys who played for Rick for a long time, and their jaws drop. You got Harrison Barnes, a guy, he's a vet. Like, he's like, what the hell? And yeah, there's so much going on with the Mavericks at all, and it continues to this day with a completely different cast of characters, which is amazing. But you mentioned that quote from Mark Cuban when he talked about, "I'm going to ship my son to Slovenia. They learn how to play basketball there." It was so stupid, and it was Cuban just like, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of press and record and let Cuban flap his gums. Let's just be honest. But this is a classic case of Cuban's just talking. He's not making sense. He's just flapping his gums. Number one, Luka left Slovenia for his adolescence to really learn how to play basketball. like to go to Real Madrid. So saying you'll ship him to Slovenia, that didn't make sense. But it definitely pissed off a lot of players in that locker room. And Harrison Barnes stood up and, gave a quote to Mark Spears, my colleague at ESPN with Anscape, and basically said how disrespectful that he thought it was. And they definitely felt like it was directed at Dennis Smith Jr., who was like, okay, listen, the basketball fit's not working out. Okay, you shouldn't have picked him in the lottery the previous year. It was clear his days in Dallas were numbered at the time. But damn, you don't have to treat him like crap on the way. The kid's not done anything wrong. He's trying. He's a good dude. Like I said, he's welcoming Luka with open arms. Let me show you around the city. I'm like, and so they felt like they were really doing Dennis dirty. And they, Harrison and Wesley Matthews and these other guys, they felt disrespected by that. And Cuban, Rick lost the locker room with the, with that team meeting in Toronto, and had to kind of hand the locker room relations over to Jamal Mosley, which then Rick felt like Mosley was gunning for his job later. That became a whole, part of the Game of Thrones thing that played out there. But then Cuban lost that locker room, and, Bob Voulgaris, kind of a infamous figure in Mavericks lore. But Bob Voulgaris says, in hindsight, Cuban losing the locker room allowed him to talk Cuban into basically dumping a bunch of veterans, including Harrison Barnes, and retrofitting the roster around Luka. Now, the other thing, though, is in this whole mix, Donnie Nelson and Cuban made this deal to go get Kristaps Porziņģis, as Luka was still unpacking his bags, basically, from Europe. And that was a trade everybody in Dallas was fired up about. Voulgaris wasn't on board with it necessarily, but the vast majority, the overwhelming opinion in Dallas was, man, Dirk's on his way out and he's handing the baton to two guys who have, 2 Euros who are going to be legendary players. And it ain't the way it played out with Porziņģis. That was the first of many, many pretty significant personnel missteps the Mavericks made, and yet they still succeeded to put a finals team together around this guy.
Yeah, there's a lot of chaos with the team. And then when you start talking about Bob, for people who don't know, Bob Voulgaris is a very rich professional gambler. The idea that the house, they did not build the house because it's built for us to win. Bob figured out a whole bunch of different ways to win and became a quantitative analyst as much as anything else with the Mavericks. And if you follow...
the shadow GM is what he became.
Yes. And if you have followed Bob on Twitter over the years, he's not a sentimental guy, right? This is what it is. And he will tell you whatever it is that he happens to think. And so you put a cold-hearted quant guy, a gambler in place, he'll do whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was an interesting observation. It's like Cuban has made these guys mad and they don't like him anymore. And so now Bob can move in here and get these guys out. Now, what is interesting is then some of the reporting, and we'll get to more of this later, after Luka was traded, was that everybody had a measure of skepticism early about Luka and his conditioning. And it is a bit of a running theme before you get to the time of the trade that this is a thing that did get on people's nerves. What I found interesting in reading the book was that you can see the things that ultimately proved to be problems later, but I don't think you or anybody is reading it, and I don't think that you were looking at them at that time as this is going to be the problem, or at the very least, this is going to be the problem soon.
Well, and it was certainly a source of frustration, and definitely has been a kind of a running theme throughout his career. But his weight fluctuations, they're overshadowed by the fact that this guy's put up as good a numbers as anybody in the history of the game has through age 26. I mean, hey, his weight fluctuated last year when he was averaging a league-leading 34 points, 10 rebounds, 9 assists, when he led the postseason in points, rebounds, assists, and steals, never been done before, and took a team to the NBA Finals. His petulance has been a running theme, the ranting at the refs and sometimes letting that affect his focus. The guy his flaws are as apparent as his talent, but his talent damn sure overshadows the flaws. There's people in Dallas who think I'm a Luka hater or a Luka critic. I've gotten how could you write a book about Luka? You hated on him his whole career. I've covered him honestly his whole career. And, I can honestly say I was as shocked. I knew how frustrated the Mavericks were with his conditioning, and I was still completely flabbergasted by the trade just because you don't give up that kind of generational talent unless he's putting the gun to your head. And he wasn't. He wasn't, despite the fraying of the relationship with Nico Harrison, and that definitely happened for a variety of reasons. Luka wanted to spend his whole career in Dallas. He wanted to have a statue out there next to Dirk's. Like, the one thing about Luka is that he does have in common with Dirk a strong sense of loyalty. And I even when I was reporting that there was fear in the organization that Luka was going to ask for a trade if they didn't get the ship turned around, the year they had to tank to keep that top 10 protected pick, it wasn't out of disloyalty. It was just because, like, dude, if it's a complete failure of a franchise around you, like, how could you not consider looking elsewhere? But, I included a chapter just on the Slovenian national team, and I thought that was important because that illustrates his loyalty. It's a case-by-case thing playing for your national team for almost every superstar in the league. He's an exception. And he didn't have to play for Slovenia. He had kind of his international free agency. He had a Spanish passport, had never played an official tournament for Slovenia. He could have easily hopped on the bandwagon of an established powerhouse in Spain. Never even discussed it with, like, his best friends, the Hernan Gomez brothers. So yeah, there's a whole lot going on here, but the idea that that Nico's thrown out there, well, we don't know if he was going to sign that Supermax. Yeah, you do. You knew he was going to. You didn't want to give it to him.
All right, now coming up next, we're going to talk more about this and what's happened with the trade and everything that has panned out, which is the most enrapturing personnel situation literally in the history of the NBA. We'll talk about why in just a second. This episode is presented by Perplexity. Perplexity is an AI-powered answer engine that searches the internet in real time to deliver fast, clear, high-quality answers. Unlike legacy search engines that respond with a list of links, Perplexity skips straight to the answers you need, explained in everyday language that's easy to understand with sources and citations. Now, Sean, how do you use Perplexity when it comes to the right time?
Bo, if you're a loyal listener or viewer of the show, you're already aware that we use it throughout the show on Mondays, especially when you need a question answered or stats confirmed. But Perplexity is great because, say you're curious about a specific topic from our show, like, what is Luka Dončić's playoff record against the Minnesota Timberwolves? You can see just how quickly Perplexity can get you that answer. And that answer is 4-1 after their Western Conference Finals matchup last season.
We'll see how that record stands after round one. Now discover faster, more reliable search with Perplexity today. Download the app or ask Perplexity anything at perplexity.com. They swoosh, you score. When any player scores 50 or more points during a game in the NBA playoffs, Dash Pass members score a free 3-piece crispy tenders combo from Wingstop. Valid on $20 plus orders from noon to midnight the day after the game with promo code April 15th through June 22nd. Terms apply. To claim the deal, just place a 3-piece crispy tenders combo order from Wingstop in your cart. Make sure your cart has a subtotal of $20 or more and drop in the promo code Wingstop50 at checkout. Then place your order and enjoy.
Yeah, who doesn't love free wings? Reminder, use code Wingstop50 the day after the game. Sign up for Dash Pass and save more all year round with $0 delivery fees and reduced service fees on eligible orders, plus exclusive perks like this one. Dash Pass is your door to more savings. As a reminder, when any player scores 50 or more points during a game in the 2025 NBA playoff season, Dash Pass members score free 3-piece crispy tenders combo from Wingstop, valid with the use of a promo code from noon to midnight the day after a 50-point game. Must have an active Dash Pass account. Terms apply.
Ready to win some real cash during the basketball playoffs? Check out Pick 6 from DraftKings. When it comes to basketball payouts, DraftKings Pick 6 posterizes the competition.
Hit all your picks and score higher, minimum payouts on Pick 6 Plus, even more cash if you outscore the competition. Pick 6 is available in most states, including Missouri, California, Texas, Georgia, and more. I made some picks last week that feature some of the biggest names during the play-in tournament, and you can join in and make your picks during the basketball playoffs as well. New players get 50 in Pick 6 credits instantly on just a $5 entry.
Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app now using code Bomani. That's code Bomani for new customers to play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Better payouts, bigger wins, only with Pick 6 from DraftKings. The crown is yours.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit ccpg.org. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Bonus awarded as a non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits that expire in 14 days. Limited time offer.
All right, we are back with Tim MacMahon. Check out his book, The Wonder Boy, on Luka Dončić. Just got through reading it this morning. It's a good read. It's a quick read. It gives you a good background on what's going on with Luka. Plus, there is a new chapter that is added in the digital editions for the trade that Tim had no idea was coming because the book would have gone a little bit differently, I think, in the past. And that is actually one thing I'm curious about in writing it. If you start this after the trade, do you think the tone that the book starts and ends with is a little bit different because you're inclined to kind of go back and see different signs that you didn't think were going to turn out the way that they did?
You know, it's funny because this book I wrote over the course of a few summers, and I definitely began writing it with the thought that it could end with a Luka trade. I just thought,
Right.
like I just said, it was going to be because he was going to have to ask for a trade because the Mavericks were going to completely fail around. Like I started writing it right after they bungled the Brunson situation,
Right.
which, coming off a conference finals, you lose the second best player for nothing. There's a whole chapter on just how badly they screwed up that situation. So I don't know how much would be different as far as how I wrote the book, because it does kind of capture all the pressure, all the drama, all this function. It's just a crazy plot twist at the end. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you, like, it would be dishonest for me to be writing it and say, okay, we should have seen this coming, that sort of a thing. And then, that last chapter that you mentioned, just to get it out there, the people who buy the actual hard copies, check my Twitter account. There's a pinned, the pinned thing is a link where you can get that copy sent to you, the chapter sent to you via PDF with proof of purchase. I've been a little frustrated at the lack of promotion of that by the publishing company, just to be honest with you. It's a pretty important chapter, the way things played out.
Scotch, right?
Yes.
Well, especially because the timing is going to make people want to get the book. And then they're like, yeah, we didn't even necessarily get around to...
Hold on. It ended with Luka happy. What happened?
Right. Like every example I'm thinking of that's analogous to this involves like a climactic death in history, but it's just kind of like, okay, this is where the book ends. Like it stops right here in this place.
It's the whole play right until Abraham Lincoln got shot.
That is the one historical example where somebody gets killed that we are allowed to analogize with freedom, right? Yes. Like my initial thought was, and then the car went into Dealey Plaza, right? But I think that one still hits people in a weird place. It's only been 60 something years as such, but that was still a little tender.
But there is a JFK reference in that final chapter. It ends with the protest before AD's debut, the first home game after the trade. And there's this prepubescent kid. They're passing the bullhorn around, and people are yelling and screaming, and and this kid goes, "I've been a Mavericks fan my whole life. This is worse than goddamn JFK."
Like, yo, little homie, you just got here, man. Yeah. Now, I want to ask this. So we get to the trade, and skipping a few steps along the way, the Mavericks make the finals. They make the trade for Kyrie Irving, right? Because I think something worth talking about with Luka is that Mark Cuban, in my eyes, has always sounded like a better owner than he was in actual application. Like there have been a lot of bad moves that have been made. The inability to sign these free agents. I think part of why we underrate Dirk is I think we underrate what he had to do largely by himself, really, in those years from like 05 to 09 or such, where you look around the rest of the roster, and God bless Michael Finley, but that's not supposed to be your second best player.
From 05 for really the rest of his career, even when they won the title, Dirk was the only all-star on that roster. Jay Kidd was like 38 years old at the time.
Yeah, and Dirk, hey, don't be giving your money back to these people. That don't mean I'm going to give this money back so you can give me a champion. Dirk, a cautionary tale in that regard, but they did kind of figure this out in 24. And I think this is kind of why the trade to me is so interesting is that Nico made the move to get Kyrie Irving in 2023 that I would have advised against, but they bet on the talent and bless Kyrie's heart. The dude that was in Brooklyn is not the dude that has been there in Dallas. He has done everything that has been asked of him. It has gone from there. And I think Nico put together an interesting team that made the finals and the kind of team that to me is like, oh, you have some insight on how to build a team because that's not the team that everybody would have built to figure out how to get there. But after the trade and the whole defense wins championships, if that was the imprint that he would have had, I would have thought that we would have heard a lot more about his team building philosophy before this. And that was one part I thought was interesting in the book, was that I didn't come away from that feeling like, oh, we know what kind of team Nico wants to have. And now suddenly he has this strident idea and it doesn't involve having Luka.
Well, and while Mark Cuban had control of the franchise, like you can have the GM title. You're the GM when he wants to let you be the GM. I mean, Cuban's still running the show. And so it wasn't until midway through last season when Cuban gave up the majority share. And, he said he was going to keep basketball operations control. That wasn't reality. I mean, it just wasn't the case. That's when Nico was able to not only take control of basketball ops, but frankly, box Cuban out. Nico did a very intentional job of boxing out and keeping Cuban completely out of the mix. But look, like you said, the Kyrie trade, controversial at the time, didn't pay immediate dividends. They have to tank that year to keep the top 10 protected pick. But Kyrie's been phenomenal in Dallas. And Kyrie and Luka formed a great chemistry. They have a bond. Kyrie really did a great job of kind of learning how to play off of Luka. Luka adapted to, play faster and realize, hey, a simpler thing as a look ahead pass. Get the ball out of his hands, play faster. That empowers Kyrie, empowers his teammates. And that was like one of the great stories of last season, was just how much that duo clicked and how much they enjoyed each other. It's kind of an iconic image where they beat Houston in overtime late in the season. They kind of collapse into each other's arms, and it was a great duo. And then, Nico made moves around like the rest of the starting lineup and rotation that worked. The pick of Derek Lively, trading down to get him at 12 overall. Dude, that's a perfect pick and roll partner for Luka. Nico wants to talk about how his trades didn't work right away or weren't popular right away. He leaves out, like, they tried to give up 2 firsts for Kyle Kuzma. Okay. And then when that fell through because somehow Kuzma had a mythical no trade clause that the Wizards let him use, then he pivoted to one of those firsts is going to Daniel Gafford. One of those firsts is going for PJ Washington. But suddenly you've got this big athletic front court, all these lob targets, all these guys who can really run. Derek Jones Jr. as a minimum was a huge addition last year. And so you've surrounded Luka with this long, athletic, supporting cast that fit around him. And the whole defense wins championship thing, it's like, dude, the Mavericks had the number 1 defense in the league for the last 20 games last year. That continued into the playoffs. They didn't lose to the Celtics because their defense fell apart. And I know you can put up a low light reel of Luka getting blown by. They lost because they didn't hit shots. And if defense wins championships, and that's it. That's the only thing you can do. That's the way we're building this team. Why'd you get Klay Thompson this summer? Like, come on, man. I know Klay's been a hell of a defender throughout the course of his career, but not coming off an Achilles and an ACL in his mid-30s. So, like, what I'm trying to tell you is Nico's plan has been very fluid, and I think he talked during his exit interview press conference about how process-oriented it is. The Luka trade was not process-oriented. The Luka trade was emotional. It was emotional, it was irrational, and it was illogical. And I can tell you for sure it was illogical because I've pressed Nico on very flawed logic in the deal, and all he can say is defense wins championships. Or like, oh, you don't like the trade. We put together a championship caliber roster. You saw it for 2.5 quarters. 2.5 quarters? Brother, I saw a finals run last year. Which one makes me believe more? Come on, man.
Well, my question about the emotion behind the trade, and it seems obvious that I would not have made that trade if for no other reason than these people might kill you. Like, this is like the idea that the fans don't matter. The example I made as I tried to come up with it, I appreciate you willing to make the hard decision, but I grew up an Atlanta Hawks fan. And when they traded Dominique at 34 years old and a torn Achilles, I never came back. And so I had to stop and say, okay, like the Dallas fans, been a little over the top, but I can't pretend as though I don't understand like the basis of the feeling. What seems surprising to me is there aren't that many people who are around this team on a regular basis that could sense that the frustration was such that a move like this would happen. Like, even with hindsight, was there any point that people could look back and say, yo, I think Nico's going to might do something wild with this team?
After Christmas, and that was Luka's 4th calf strain in 28 months, same calf, left calf. And Nico definitely blamed poor conditioning for that. Luka's people said, hey, he's come back too soon from injuries, including the left heel. He's whatever. So there was this divide between Nico and Luka's camp for sure. And the level of frustration that Nico had at that time was high. By the way, Jay Kidd's was too. And, I think Jay Kidd's kind of trying to distance himself from
yes,
this.
he is.
Jay Kidd's frustration level was, I can just tell you with Luka, was also quite high. But, I was told at the time, hey, if we got to trade him, and obviously it's off the record, but they traded him now, so I'll say it. If we got to trade him, we'll trade his ass. And I'm like, no, you won't. I seriously, I rolled my eyes. I'm like, okay, you're huffing, you're puffing. You ain't blowing that house down. Give me a break. Because it's a ludicrous thing to consider. And how many times, Bomani, have you been talking to somebody and they huff, they puff, they're just talking shit. They ain't going to do anything. And I thought this was one of those cases. And then 6 weeks later, my phone dings. What?
They did it.
What? They actually did it? Again, I was told, venting. We'll trade this guy if we have to. But here's the thing. You didn't have to. You didn't have to. You went to the finals months ago. Okay, the weight fluctuates. There's some defiance. I get it. It's frustrating. Typically, historic production gives a guy a little bit of leeway. And I will just say, and I kind of included this in the last chapter, there are a lot of people who are very strong defenders of Luka who have either been in that organization or remain in that organization. And I'm not going to tell you Luka's low maintenance. I'm just going to tell you on the superstar spectrum in the NBA, he's not toward the top. He's not. You can go down the list of superstars. There are several who are more high maintenance than Luka. Somebody in the book says, ask Miami if they'd have rather dealt with Luka or Jimmy Butler for the last few months, leading up to the trade deadline. That's just one example. You don't give up that kind of talent if he's excited about spending his entire career with your franchise.
Now, see, that's an interesting counterpoint because Jimmy's people will tell you he was very excited about staying there. They just didn't want to give him the money to do it, right?
Well, and again, one, I would say that kind of talent, Luka's a bigger talent than Jimmy Butler. He just is. And two, the obvious thing is Jimmy Butler's a decade older.
Yes.
They could have had a decade plus run into the future with Luka. And this is where the logic really falls apart. Nico Harrison's own words, he created a 3 to 4 year time frame. And forget what's happened. Obviously, the first year got blown up when Kyrie went down with a knee injury. Next year's in jeopardy. That 3 to 4 year time frame, you gave up to successfully build a contender around Luka, your first round draft capital in 27, 28, 29, and 30. So just as the credit card bill is coming due, your time frame ends. And then, how is that? And I asked Nico straight up in this, weird, no cameras allowed roundtable thing. How is that in the best interest of the Dallas Mavericks? He just kept repeating defense wins championships.
So is there any recovery possible for Nico? Because at this point, I don't just believe that he has cost himself this job. I don't know what other job he's supposed to get. He obviously can't go back to Nike. I believe Luka still has shoes there. That's not going to happen. He can't get a job with another NBA team right now. I've never seen a backlash against an executive like this ever before. The closest I could give you is Donald Sterling 2014. It's that level of vitriol that he receives. So where does he go from here? Because I do think the roster they had, if Kyrie was healthy, would be an interesting one to watch. I thought they were going to be fine in the short run. But then, of course, you also then reported this week for ESPN that the medical staff is the issue there, and that the medical staff that Nico has brought in may be part of the reason why they were down to 8 players earlier at this point. So what do you do from now if you are Nico Harrison?
Yeah, the medical staff is certainly an issue. I would say it's on a list. I don't know. I don't know. And look, man, Nico's obviously, he was running Nike's North American basketball ops for a long time. That's a well-paying position. So is being a general manager of an NBA team. Maybe he just rides off into the sunset. I don't know. But there's I was talking to somebody who's in an ownership group of another Western Conference team recently, and they basically said, I hate to say it, but this is going to be his legacy. This trade's his legacy. He's never going to work in the NBA again. And like, there are people around the league who are just like, you have to fire him. Like you that's the only way to begin the healing process with the Mavericks fan base. But Patrick Dumont is not there. He's not there yet. Now, the in Nico we trust era has ended. He wants him to bring in an experienced exec, and like, I think he's realized, like, okay, we've got to have some checks and balances that weren't in place. I think this has been a very educational experience for Patrick Dumont in his first full year as an NBA governor. Also, the realization of, hey, in this world, management's not the stars. The stars are the guys on the floor. That's what this whole league revolves around. The superstars are the guys who drive business in this league, not the bosses.
Well, my thinking is Dumont can't move on from this because he's just too in on this, right? Like, this is they were in on this together, and they have to answer. I can't believe Nico said this out loud in front of people. And Tim Cato's reporting indicates a similar thing about Dumont, that somehow they didn't know that the fans would be this mad. And I will just say this part, and it's hard to ignore. I think that this is a league of 30 teams. I don't care if you're from America or not. You have a white superstar that people pay to see, right? Like, not just some like scrappiness or whatever it is. You have the rarest commodity in the NBA, and you traded it and didn't think that the locals were going to have a problem with it.
I'm not qualified to do the kind of sociological deep dive into this, but there's definitely elements there for sure. And honestly, like, as frankly illogical of a basketball decision as this was, I think what's going to ultimately cost Nico his job is this was a terrible, terrible business decision. I think they might lose $1 billion worth of revenue over the course of what would have been a $345 million contract. Nico convinced Patrick Dumont that Supermax deal would be a terrible investment. And look, he thinks Luka's body's going to break down. We'll see if he's right or wrong. I don't care if he suffers a major injury. Luka would have had insane trade value on that contract, just like Damian Lillard did. But where was Dame's? Dame wanted to go to MI somewhere. It wasn't MIL.
He wanted to go to MIAMI. It ended up in MIL-Walkie.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because why? Why could they do that? Because he was locked up long term. So if you wanted to trade the guy, the Supermax was your best weapon. But anyways, the bottom line, Patrick Dumont doesn't understand basketball. Okay, you like basketball, sure. He doesn't get basketball. He gets business. He gets when you're bleeding on the bottom line. And this was a disastrous business decision.
Well, look, we're going to see how this goes. Wish I had more time, but Tim MacMahon is a busy man, and these playoffs are not going to cover themselves. Check out his book, The Wonder Boy. It's a look at Luka Dončić through his NBA career all the way back to Slovenia. I just finished it up this morning. It's a good read. I recommend you guys check it out, and I thank you so much for giving us the time.
Bomani, man, I really appreciate you having me. Thanks for all the kind words. It has been an absolute pleasure, and adios amigo.
All right, man. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us here on The Right Time. We do this 3 times a week. Sean Hughes handling everything behind the scenes. Thank you, sir. Remember, follow The Right Time. Subscribe, like, rate us, review us, give us 5 stars. You only give us 4 stars. I'm inclined to believe you are a hater, and we'll talk to you guys in a couple of days. Take it easy.